sources out there, but we'll just stick, and we know that there's some variation, but we'll just stick for simplicity of conversation with this. The numbers have been updated as they get updated, as we expect them to be over the last few weeks. And now California is at 45% of white voters in California chose Trump. And 51% chose Biden. That's a 4 percentage point difference in a state of California that might surprise a lot of Californians in the way we think of ourselves as such a blue state. If only whites voted, obviously be a very different situation nationally, and it would be a really close race in California. And Trump's level of support from white voters overall nationally was about the same as 2016, which also might, right? We've kind of alluded to that, also surprises people. So just a couple of quick slides here on disparities, just want to emphasize. So we have differences in preferences around party and candidates, and we have differences in disparities of those who actually turn out, and that's why we have a representative, an electorate that's not representative. So, and there are real implications, not just for candidates, but ultimately for the policy implications from those candidates, right? So let me move here. Well, I just had a point. If disparities in turnout were eliminated, of course, the election results would have looked different and would have constituted a much stronger mandate for Biden, we can at least expect. So just to give you, we don't have the numbers yet by race ethnicity nationally for 2020. These numbers here are from the current population survey, a product of the census, but I can show you 2016. In 2016, the turnout for that data source was 61%. You can see whites at 65%, again, eligible voter turnout of adult citizens, blacks at 59%, Latinos, Asian Americans down into the 40s, right? Significant differences by race ethnicity. And just really quickly to make that point that I said they were entrenched. This is a timeline, same data source, current population survey, going back to 1980. The purple line is the total population. The blue line is the white, non-Latino or non-Asian. You can see that group has the highest turnout, and you can see much lower Black, Latino, Asian American. Black, there's an exception, of course, in 2012. But what story we see here is a consistent story of significant gaps in turnout, right? Which leads to significant underrepresentation. So let's talk now about race and politics explicitly. So we know that our country has a long and deep and ugly history of racism, structural racism, interpersonal racism, the list goes on. That is still the case. We're dealing with that history, and we still are a racist country in so many ways. Trump's presidency has made more, I'll say more, not all, but more Americans face this reality, where Barack Obama was elected president, and we heard so much about the U.S. being post-racial. We knew that wasn't the case, right? And we're really faced with this reality and very difficult to run from it with the Trump presidency. But here's the thing that's so important, right, for our conversation today. The rhetoric around race, period, but particularly Donald Trump's rhetoric, divisive rhetoric, is seen very differently by people of different racial and ethnic groups, or people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds and groups. Many of those that oppose Trump, right, in this election, cannot fathom why anyone would vote for somebody, right? Republican or otherwise, take out party. How could someone vote? We hear this over and over again in our own families, friends, neighbors, colleagues, people on social media. How can you vote for somebody who's trafficking in racial tropes if you don't flat out think that he's a racist, period? But Trump supporters, and we've seen a number of surveys, that they often report that they don't see his actions as racist at all. And indeed, if you think about, again, his own strategy and how he talks, how his racist rhetoric is structured, if he's dealing in stereotypes, he's usually using probabilistic stereotypes, right? He's saying, he's not saying all Mexicans are rapists. He's saying some are rapists, right? And some are very good people.
Importantly, he wrote a book called The Anger Gap, How Race Shapes Emotions in Politics, and I think this is very relevant. So welcome, Professor Phoenix.
Thank you for having me. So I will try to be very brief, given we're short on time, and apologies for having to come from the meeting. But so I don't have any slides. I just want to highlight, I think, some of the trends that I've uncovered in years of assessing how race shapes who gets to be publicly angry over politics, and how the polity, how the media, and how political officials treat different groups inequitably based on their airing of their grievances. So the main takeaway from the research in the book is that people of color express much less anger than their white counterparts over the same kind of political objects, whether it's reflecting on elections that didn't turn out the way they want, reflecting on the out-partisan or the kind of things that they identify, like polarization or specific policies. So this runs in stark contrast, at least in the case of African Americans, right, to that very pervasive stereotype of the angry Black person. So not only are people of color expressing less anger, but anger is much less mobilizing of political behavior for people of color than it is for white Americans. And so when we see white Americans expressing anger over politics across the ideological spectrum, they're more likely to act on that anger, to go to the voting booth or donate to candidates, canvass for candidates, but also to contact elected officials, work with community members, protest and boycott. In contrast, when Black and Latinx and Asian Americans express anger over politics, they're not anywhere near to the degree of their white counterparts more likely to vote or canvass or donate, not any more likely to contact officials. They are more likely to protest and boycott. And so I think we see that play out, right, with a long history of activism from groups of color. What is that representing? That's representing people of color's anger being directed not towards a particular regime within a system or a particular kind of party platform, but at the system itself, a system that they fundamentally believe is not responsive to their interests. So I want to take that question of anger, whereas in the book, I focus on kind of what it does and does not do for people of color. I think Pilar invited me to consider how we think about that anger in the context of 2020 and maybe these gains that Trump made with white voters, maybe particularly white women voters. So let's actually take it back to 2016. When we think about ways in which voters of color kind of depart from expectations, oftentimes the inquisition becomes, well, why did they do this? What was wrong with them? Why were they not maybe more sophisticated or more vigilant? So after 2016, when Black and Latinx turnout in particular was lower than expected, there's a lot of hand-wringing over why. So Dr. Romero talked about that sleeping giant, right? This long-running narrative kind of really bounds the way we think about the Latinx turnout. But the question is, right, like if Trump represents a particular threat to these groups, why wouldn't they respond with energetic turnout to stave off that threat? And my research says when people of color encounter these threats, they're more likely to withdraw from politics or pursue alternative forms of acting. And so by problematizing the disinclination to vote, we're kind of missing the fuller picture of what people of color view as utility or lack of utility in that vote, primarily or acutely when they're in positions of threat. In contrast, when white Americans, to the surprise of many pollers and pundits, kind of came out in fuller force for Trump, creating that unlikely victory, I think there's a misread of the emotions that propelled that vote choice. What was the kind of overarching message about that vote? Economic anxiety, right? Anxiety is a specific emotion. It's a fear. It's a sense of unsettling. And what does that emotion translate to, as we know from social psychology? Questioning your predispositions and maybe considering new options. Did Trump kind of represent anxiety or fear, or did he represent anger, right? What does anger represent? When you're angry, and you know, we've all been in this situation, we've all thought, well, I shouldn't have done that, but I was angry, right? You are more impulsive, you are less risk averse, and you feel slighted, and you feel a compulsion to right that wrong. And so anger is a palpable force, not only for getting people active in politics, but for making them double down on what their existing ideas are. And so I see that doubling down effect in 2020. So why is it important for us to distinguish anxiety versus anger? Because you have to understand the object of that anger. The idea was people are anxious because the economy is unsettling and maybe white Americans feel that the kind of ground is shifting beneath their feet for a bit. And Trump represents kind of an assuring force, right? That they will not lose their dominant status within politics and within society. But if we think about that kind of relationship to that sense of lost status, not as I'm afraid about it, let me speak slower, but I'm more angry about it, we kind of understand the way in which our politics is very much determined by kind of in groups versus out groups. And so if we thought, okay, people see some kind of promise represented by Trump in 2016, but 4 years later, they're going to maybe come to their senses or not see Trump as living up to that promise, and seeing the divisiveness and seeing the toll of COVID, seeing kind of the loss of the US standing in the world. There's this maybe expectation that was not founded that white Americans, maybe specifically white women, would move away from Trump. But what did Trump very effectively do throughout those 4 years? Continue to engender and activate that sense of anger. And so that anger, again, causes people to double down. And so even if people can be dissatisfied over the last 4 years, Trump and the media's ecosystem around him continually gave them outlets for that anger that were directed away from Trump. And so that's really important for us to understand. Why is that really critical? Because there's almost a sense that, well, people might regret their vote choice in 2016 or regret not voting in 2016. And why might not people regret that? There is a great deal of normalization of Trump and of Trump voters. We can consider how important it is that there were so many very intensive efforts to create these profiles of Trump voters that were often very sympathetic, right? Very understanding. And these come from an authentic place. People not understanding how so many people could support Trump and trying to understand that. But that has the process of normalizing and legitimizing the grievances that people acted on as they voted for Trump. And so when 2020 comes around, I think this bears out, more people that were probably on the fence in 2016 felt they could comfortably cast that vote in 2020. Why? Because, well, he's been normalized, and kind of the ethos or the mythos of Trump supporters has been normalized. So it's really important for us to think about not just the kind of divisiveness that has been accelerated by Trump, but how those dividing lines, particularly of race, but also of gender and religion and socioeconomic status, are definitive elements of our politics. Not just defining the divide between left and right, but even defining the divide within the Democratic faction as well. And so when we think about people being angry over potential loss of status, right, that anger is not going to cause them to evaluate Trump by the metrics that we might expect. And that, I think, really ties together with Dr. Romero's last points there about we have very different lenses through which we see COVID or Racism America, right? Or the protests. And so while we kind of can bend over backwards to understand why white people might vote for Trump and think, well, what is the sense of grievance that they're tapping into? Let's draw a contrast between how we can problematize the political behavior of people of color. So remember early in the primary season, there were people prominent within the Democratic Party that said Black voters were unsophisticated for supporting Biden in the primaries, right? This is similar to the kind of problematizing of turnout rates of Black and Latinx voters in 2016. There's a real important contrast, and I'll end here, right? When white people can vote for Trump, the question becomes, well, what is the problem within the system that we're tapping into? How can we better understand their position so that we can see